Welcome to Recora's first webinar on understanding your carbon emissions. This is going to cover, it's going to start with a quiz on climate change for beginners. So we're going to cover the science of climate change and net zero, see how much you know already. I'm sure a lot of you already know most of it, but it's always good to tighten up those knowledge gaps now and then. Then we're going to talk about how climate change affects businesses in terms of climate change laws and corporate regulations. Then we're going to talk about how you in a business can reduce your carbon footprint and the regulatory requirements of doing so, before I transfer to Bree, who's going to lead you through how you can work on your own carbon footprint as an individual and consumer to get that down. First of all, let's take the quiz. If everybody could use this QR code to join the Mentimeter, that would be great. And I'm going to switch over to the Mentimeter screen now. You will have to take this on your phone. So could everybody please get their phone out and join this quiz? Got 2 people. Do you think you could join it just to make sure it's working? Yeah. There's 6 people in it now. Wait for my players. Okay, we've got 18. If I go 19 players. Do they need to see the, does anyone need to see the QR code? I'm monitoring the chat. Yeah. Great, okay, I think we're going to start. Right, question 1. Over the next 100 years, average global temperatures are predicted to do what? Are they predicted to decrease, by which I mean get cooler? Are they predicted to increase, meaning get warmer? Or do you think they're going to stay the same? All right, everyone has voted. Let's see what the results are. We've got 20 submissions, so everyone picked the correct category. Well done. Yes, as you will know, the last 10 years have been the warmest on record. It's predicted only to get hotter. Here is a graph of average global temperatures since the Industrial Revolution. As you can see, it's been going up pretty steadily ever since. Right, we've got 21 players ready. We've got a new addition. If anyone doesn't have the QR code, please just raise your hand in the chat and Bree can send you it. Right, here we go. Question 2. What is the main cause of this warming? We've got 3 options. We've got humans are burning fossil fuels. We've got more humans than ever on the planet breathing out carbon dioxide. Or we have the sun is getting hotter. Which do you think it is? 17, 16, 15 seconds. We've almost got everyone voted. I think we've just got 1 or 2 more people left to vote. 9, 8, 7. Give it a go. If you get it wrong, it doesn't matter. Okay. Here we go. Yes, well done. Most people got that correct. Humans are burning fossil fuels. We have a few people who have chosen the sun is getting hotter. I understand that that is some information people usually get, but it is unfortunately not correct. The right answer is that more humans are burning fossil fuels, and we'll talk about a bit more about fossil fuels and how that's causing global warming just now. Right, so yes, if you could all enter this one, it's just select which ones. Oh, I'm afraid I think you all saw that. Select which ones you think are the fossil fuels. Great, we've got lots of good answers here. Okay. All right. Give you a couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Oh, and the correct answers are oil, coal, and natural gas. So a few people picked biomass and nuclear there. Biomass is, as you can see from that picture, it's any fuel made from wood or a sort of animal or plant source. And that is not a fossil fuel. It does release carbon when it burns, but it actually absorbs the same amount of carbon when it grows as it releases during combustion. So we do not consider it to be contributing to climate change unless there's deforestation involved. And it also isn't dug out the ground from fossilized plants or animals, which is what oil, coal, and natural gas are made of. Nuclear does come from very highly reactive substances that are dug out of the ground, but those are also not considered fossil fuels because, once again, they're not made from fossilized carbon. Okay, get everyone ready for question 3. Right, how is burning fossil fuels leading to global warming? We'll just try and whiz through these next few. Do we think there's too much heat from the fire is warming the earth? Do we think too much carbon dioxide is emitted into the atmosphere? Or do we think that the fumes are toxic to animals? 3, 2, 1. Right, too much carbon dioxide is being emitted into the atmosphere. Right, so what happens when you burn a fossil fuel is you create a chemical reaction called combustion. This produces lots of heat, light, and some water vapor, but also a chemical called carbon dioxide, which happens when the carbon in the fuel reacts with the oxygen in the air. That gas is very special. That gas has the ability to absorb heat, which lots of gases do not have the ability to do. In fact, only gases that are called greenhouse gases can absorb heat, and those get trapped in the atmosphere, causing that global temperature increase. This is a graph of CO2 levels directly measured from an observatory in Hawaii. As you can see, those are going up pretty linearly, and that fluctuation that you see is actually annual seasons. So that is the growing and dying cycle of plants globally. Right, and this is why we have to talk about net zero, is that the greenhouse gases are getting trapped in that atmosphere and they are preventing the temperature from going down. So temperature will not decrease as emissions decrease, and we'll cover that slightly more just in a minute. Right, here we go. So higher global temperatures are going to result in which effects? If you could select which you think it's going to cause, that'd be great. Okay, we've got some immediate good responses here. The options are more extreme storms, flooding, drought, species extinctions, better beach holidays, property damage, or ice sheets melting. Right, I'm going to give you 3, 2, 1, go. Right, so all of those are correct other than your better beach holidays. I'm afraid that sea level rises will probably reduce the amount of beach globally, so there will be fewer better good beaches to go and holiday on, which is very upsetting for those people like me who love a beach holiday. But yes, all of those other options are very possible and likely with global temperatures increasing. Go. Question 4 of 4. This is a little fun question to finish off. Since 1990, the UK's total greenhouse gas emissions have done what? Do you think those greenhouse gas emissions have halved? Have they increased a bit, or have they doubled? 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, most people here are pessimists. And unfortunately, or fortunately, the correct answer is halved. And here is a graph to prove you that point. The UK reached peak emissions in 1990, and actually our emissions continue to fall. As you can see there, that last part of the graph, we have really successfully cut our emissions by half since then. So net zero very much is within our grasp. Right, and the person who got the most is Amy. I think these are all anonymized, so you should be able to answer with no fear. Right, great. Right, we're going to go back to the webinar now. Present this. Right. So just to make sure we have a little very quick recap, Bree is here to cover that science of climate change, which we just talked about there in the quiz.
So climate change is essentially a chain reaction. As you can see, it goes from 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the first one being human activities. Human activities are the worst thing for the climate by burning fossil fuels and deforestation. This creates chemical reactions and increases the greenhouse gas emissions. The CO2 then floats up into the Earth's atmosphere and it changes the composition. And what this does is it results in warming of the climate and global warming. And if you think about it this way, so if an ice cube is at -1 degree, it will be solid. But if it's at 0 degrees, then it will start to melt. So this is proof that small changes, so like a degree difference, actually makes a massive impact. And then this results in climate change, which is more severe weather changes, as you've probably seen, and this creates global damage. So the purpose of net zero, what we're trying to achieve here is we need to stop burning the fossil fuels and transition to renewable energy, and this will have a knock-on effect for the rest that will come with over time.
Thank you, Bree. That's excellent. Just to recap that point on the global temperature increasing here, and what we mean when we say that emissions, temperature will not go down as emissions go down. This is a little diagram of the normal carbon cycle. So if humans weren't burning fossil fuels, which we weren't doing only a few hundred years ago, the main sources of carbon are volcano eruptions and animal respiration, and probably a few forest fires along the way. That carbon is a very small amount of carbon. It's going around the system. It floats up into the atmosphere, but it eventually gets reabsorbed by the Earth through the ocean and through plant photosynthesis, and it keeps it very balanced. What humans are doing looks a bit like this. We have essentially turned that faucet on, the carbon going into the atmosphere, kind of as hard as it's ever been. And the Earth doesn't have the ability to remove any more than it originally did. So it's causing this overflow effect. All of that carbon dioxide is going and filling up the atmosphere in this kind of large store it can't escape. We're creating this unbalanced system, which is really breaking the carbon cycle. What a net zero scenario would do is try and turn that faucet off. What that would mean is that all the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere will continue to stay there. It's going to keep causing that warming until it leaves. So the temperature will remain high, but eventually, over a long period of time, the Earth's natural ability to absorb carbon through the ocean and through trees, and probably some new technologies that we're going to invent over the way, will help remove it and get those temperatures down. We talked a lot about fossil fuels, and the reason we do is that that is the main source of emissions, accounting for almost 3/4 of human-caused emissions. But it is important, particularly as a waste company, that we mention waste, and we mention other sources of emissions other than burning fossil fuels. Things like land use and farming have quite a significant impact, as well as landfills and water waste disposal. Those are also sources of emissions, in addition to industrial processes, things like aluminium smelting, which cause emissions themselves. So it's good to remember that climate change is a much more diverse picture when we think about the sources of emission. But when we focus on fossil fuels, we do so for a very good reason, because that is where the majority are coming from. Right, so net zero and your business. Net zero is going to come and affect your business very rapidly, even if it isn't doing so already. Because we're here talking about business, talking about making money, talking about profits, it's important to mention that it isn't necessary for your profits or for your national growth to decrease as you cut emissions. As I showed you that graph about 1990, the UK has successfully cut our greenhouse gas emissions while continuing to grow our GDP. You can successfully decouple your economy from carbon, and it doesn't have to be directly tied. All of the legislation that you will come into contact with, maybe you've heard the word SECA, maybe you've heard PAS 2080, maybe you've heard about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. These all are downstream of international action on climate change, the most important being the 2015 Paris Accords, sometimes called the Paris Agreement, which was an international treaty to keep global warming below 2 degrees with a target of 1.5 degrees. That was agreed by almost every UN acknowledged nation on the planet. This has trickled down over the last decade into a series of laws that countries have adopted. So the UK has adopted the climate change, the Paris Agreement, and it's also introduced the 2008 climate change law, which was recently updated, which has announced that the UK will be net zero by 2050. That is our legislative commitment. We also hosted the UN Conference of Parties called the COP. If you hear COP, that's what it means. It's just a big conference where all of the nations who were part of the Paris Agreement come together to talk about action on climate change. 2021, we made quite a lot of movement as the host country to introduce more regulation too. So those regulations are they're already in force for listed companies and for large companies, but they're starting to be seen in tenders for smaller companies as well. So it's something that you should really kind of have a look at. And if you have specific questions about that, always reach out to me. I'm always happy to answer your questions about climate change regulation. All those regulations will ask you to do some amount of these two actions: report and reduce. Reporting is really measurement and sort of what we say disclosure, but that's quite a complicated word. So you can also just think of it as publishing. You just have to measure something and then publish what you measured to a public audience. A lot of the data that they want you to measure is, so they want you to measure emissions, but you often can't measure emissions directly. So you sort of measure something else. You measure how much you spent, you measure how much you bought, you measure how much you consumed of various different things such as fuel or electricity or transportation services. And through sort of technical carbon accounting ways, you turn that into an emissions, and you can produce a report that says that your business produced this number of emissions from this many sources over a certain period of time. Most of the UK's current climate regulations require businesses to do some amount of this. And the more rigorous regulations ask you to do it in more depth over a long period of time for more categories. Some of the regulations ask you also to start to reduce or to put plans in place to reduce your carbon. And the thing with this is that it is going to come down to what you're willing to spend and how you're willing to explore cost savings as well. If you're going to transition your fuel supply to an alternative fuel like HVOs or like biofuels, or if you're going to transition to electrification, so you want to electrify your fleet or you want to electrify parts of your heating, that is going to have an upfront investment cost. However, there is that potential to make money on the back end from efficiency gains. If you have an electric car, it's often cheaper to charge it than it is to fill it at the gas station. So that upfront investment in your infrastructure will save you money along the line. There are, however, many areas of climate mitigation and of carbon reduction which are just investments, which are just going to be additional costs. And until we come up with some new technologies, which are happening all the time, you can predict there will be a larger price tag associated with it. But being clever about it means looking into both investments, costs, and savings. Briefly addressing scopes before we move on to your own individual carbon footprint. There are this word scope, it floats around a lot. I have conversations with people where they really can't understand what it means, what a scope is. It's sort of very big, scared eyes when I say the word scope. And so let's get rid of scope and let's stop talking about scope and let's start talking about categories, because everyone understands what a category is. It's just a box where you put a specific type of thing in. So all of these regulations are asking you to calculate your emissions, to measure your emissions and publish your emissions into these three categories. The first category, what we call scope 1, are those direct emissions. This is going to be almost completely just your fuel. Any fuel that you buy and that you burn is going to release a direct emission into the atmosphere. That's going to go in your scope 1. Scope 2 is a little bit more sort of conceptual to think about. All the electricity that you consume, so that, for instance, Recora is consuming right now in doing this webinar, in turning the lights on, in powering this laptop, that comes from a power station somewhere, which we are sourcing from the grid. And so what you have to do is to sort of turn your energy consumption into an emissions associated with the emissions of the whole UK grid. That's the second category. We call that indirect emissions, and that's scope 2. Your third category is this sort of like huge nebulous category called scope 3. This is where we sort of shove all of those supply chain emissions. So emissions associated with everything you buy, emissions associated with transportation services, with the computer equipment you purchase, with the waste transportation that you purchase, with your financial investments, franchises. It's this 15 separate subcategories of scope 3. But what it is trying to do is paint this huge picture, paint this very in-depth picture of how one business is tied to all of these other businesses, which all also emit. If you're a small business, you're unlikely to have to look too much at Scope 3, but if you're a large business, Scope 3 is going to be looming in the distance for you, and you're going to have to really try and get a grip on that quite soon. All right, and back over to Bree to talk about net zero and you and what you can do to decrease your emissions and mitigate climate change.
So first off, we're going to get you guys to scan this QR code. I'll give you a few minutes just to have a look and scan it, but just do this quiz as I'm speaking, essentially.
Do I put it in the chat? The QR code.
No, that's good. Okay.
No, we're going to give you, you've got 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Great. If you just do that while we talk through the next bit.
So how big is carbon? Because a lot of people don't actually know how big it is. And so when you compare it to other things that people know what they look like and how big they are, it's a lot easier to understand. So we'll start off with the burning 1 milk pint of diesel. So burning one of these will produce 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide. But if you're burning 2 water butts of diesel, this will create 1 ton of carbon dioxide. And if the average UK person has a carbon footprint of around 13 tons of carbon dioxide per year, that is 26 water butts produced. So it is a lot. So we want to reduce our personal emissions as well. So ways that you can decrease your own emissions in your personal life. Some things that you might not think will have a big impact, but will actually have a really big impact are food, waste, shopping, transport, flying, voting, and energy. So the strategies that we use to decrease emissions are either swapping or stopping. So high impact emission swaps include increasing plants. So as a lot of you probably know, meat produces a lot of...
I'll go to that one.
Yeah. It produces a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. So by reducing this, you can reduce your emissions. So if you eat, say, 1 meatless meal a week, it will also help reduce your carbon emissions, which is really good. And then other ones include separation for recycling. So a lot of people know that, well, we send our recycling to partnerships who actually recycle it, and we do regular audits on these sites to make sure that they're actually doing what they say that they're doing. But our general waste goes to incineration. So by recycling, we actually reduce the emissions. It's a lot less emissions produced with recycling than it would be with general waste. Another one to do is sustainable fashion. So this could be using more sustainable sites and not using like Shein or anything like that. But you could also go thrift shopping. So a lot of stuff that I buy is usually from Vinted, stuff like that. So you could do that to help reduce how much. And honestly, you don't need as many clothes as people think that you need. Public transport. So the way that you get around is really important. So if you use a car, it's obviously going to use a lot more emissions. But living in London, I don't actually know many people who have a car. I mean, I don't, and I don't think that you need one. No.
I don't have a car.
I don't think many people in this will probably have a car either. Another way to do it is to swap anything gas to heat pumps, as this will also reduce the emissions, and switching your regular tariff to a green energy tariff.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that if you are using a lot of electricity, like let's say that you have an electric car, it can actually be a lot cheaper to be on a green energy tariff because they will give you really good rates through the night when energy demand is low, but when the wind is still blowing.
Yeah,
so it's great. So you know, there are these clever ways to save energy to save costs while decreasing your emissions.
Yeah, and it's also cheaper on fuel. So
yeah, of course.
So the high impact emission stops would be to stop eating beef.
Yeah,
but not many people probably that.
We like to say, you know, the single largest thing that one person could do in one action to reduce their personal carbon footprint would be to stop eating beef. And that is because, as we show you this little graph, that top line is the emissions of beef. So beef is producing up 99 kilos of CO2 for every kilo of that food substance, while bananas, a kilo of bananas is producing literally less than a hundredth of the carbon dioxide for the same amount of food mass. And if you want to look at a protein source that's different, of course, beef is very high in protein, but tofu, it's only 3.2 kilos for a kilo of tofu versus the 99 you're getting from beef. So this is one of those things where when people say it has a really big impact, it really is true.
And then another one is food waste. So if you plan your meals, so something that I do personally is I meal prep, and this is a way that I reduce food and I only buy what I need from the supermarket, because that can also have quite a high impact on emissions. Fast fashion, so like I mentioned, like Shein, Boohoo, stuff like that, they're obviously not good for the environment. If it's really cheap, it's generally not the case that it's doing very good. And it's usually made out of materials that are harmful for the environment. So cars, that's another one. So like we said, living in London, you don't really need a car, but it's always good to, if you do have a car and if you have the money to switch it to electric, because it will save on a lot of emissions and it will also save money in the long run.
Mm-hmm.
Unnecessary flights. So if you work for a business that often sends you on flights, you can suggest to them to try making it an online meeting instead, because then you can reduce your emissions that way. And then single-use tableware, so disposable coffee cups. How much was it that you said that produced carbon dioxide?
So it's about 100 grams of carbon dioxide in one disposable coffee cup. So if you're having a takeaway coffee every day, that is racking up the carbon emissions of your own personal footprint, which you could just bring a reusable cup for.
So and these go to general waste unless you have an actual coffee cup waste stream, which is also really bad, because then it goes for incineration.
Right. So just to go over that, as we say, what you eat tends to matter more than where it comes from. As you can see, the transport there, that's the red little thing. You can barely see that in a lot of those graphs. Transportation doesn't have very much of an impact versus the actual sort of the farming emissions. So that cow is farting a lot of methane, and that is contributing to climate change. And so trying to avoid those ruminant animals is quite significant, as is avoiding any food source that's causing a lot of deforestation. Covered that, and that's the end of the webinar. Thank you very much for attending. I hope you learned something. If you have any questions, please fire away to me or Bree. You can
pop it in the chat, or
pop it in the chat. My email is kirsten.smith@recora.co.uk. Happy to talk about any climate regulations that might be affecting your business. Bree would be happy to help you with any ways of decreasing your personal footprint or engaging with your customers on climate change. And Recora is always here to help manage your waste in the most sustainable way possible. So if you have any questions, just put them in the chat. But otherwise, thank you very much.
Yeah, we'll just be here for a few minutes if you do have any questions.